Hey guys, and welcome back to part 2 of the respiratory system. So yesterday we looked at the anatomy of the respiratory system. We looked at all the different parts starting from the nose and made our way down from superior to inferior, traveling down the channel in which air flows into the lungs. And that was where we left off, was once air gets to the lungs, and we talked about how it travels down the trachea into the primary bronchi, then into the secondary bronchi, to the tertiary bronchi, and then into these even tinier branches known as the bronchioles. And within this upside down tree, you could say, within our lungs, it ends at what's known as the alveoli. And these alveoli are where we have our site of gas exchange in the respiratory system, where oxygen from the outside is going to diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide from the blood is going to diffuse back into the lungs to be pushed out. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how this all happens. We're going to be talking about the physiology of the respiratory system. We're going to look at the 4 main stages and how this gas exchange actually works. So again, just to kind of reiterate, what's happening here is these alveoli, these tiny little air sacs, they're going to fill up when you breathe in. So everybody take a deep breath. When you breathe in and then breathe out, you have a large amount of gases being exchanged. And basically what's happening in a nutshell is you have a high amount of oxygen when you breathe in the alveoli. And alveoli is just the plural for the alveolus, which are these little sacs. But again, you have a large amount of oxygen in these alveoli, and it's going to want to diffuse through these capillaries. Remember, the capillaries are the smallest of our blood vessels. You notice there's some blue and red here to indicate that blood with and without oxygen, because again, that's where this transfer is happening. That's what our capillaries are for. Our capillaries are to help with that transfer or that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, whether in the lungs or anywhere in our body. And that's going to be important to remember. So how does this gas exchange work? Well, again, like I've already stated, it's through the process of diffusion. When something is moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So when we breathe in, that oxygen that's now in our lungs is in a very high concentration, and it wants to diffuse to an area where it's not as heavily present, and so it's going to diffuse into the bloodstream. Likewise, within the lungs, at those alveolar capillaries, there's an extremely high presence of carbon dioxide. Or at least I should say, the presence of carbon dioxide is more extreme in the capillaries than it would be in the lungs itself during inhalation, when we're breathing in. And so naturally, that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the capillaries and into the alveolar ducts. Now within these alveolar ducts, where the alveoli are present, there's also cells known as the alveolar macrophages. And if you remember what phages are like a phagocyte. And if you remember what that is, that means it's just a cell that eats things. And so these are kind of like a guard cell, if you will. They're sometimes referred to as a dust cell. And as we're breathing in or breathing out, they're going to be picking up traces of bacteria that maybe we inhale, and they're going to make sure that they don't get into the bloodstream, and they're basically going to destroy those and other carbon particles and things like that. And so again, they play an important role in making sure that we only get the things in our bloodstream that we want to. Likewise, we have certain molecules that are going to coat these alveolar ducts to make sure that it protects the surface. So this is just showing you how it's transferring. Again, the red portion represents our capillary where our red blood cell is at, and we can see that the carbon dioxide is going to transfer over because it's in a higher concentration here. The oxygen, meanwhile, during inhalation, when we're breathing in, it's in a higher concentration in the alveolar duct, and it's going to diffuse into the capillaries and then attach itself to the red blood cell. So, the physiology of respiration. Respiration itself is not just breathing. Breathing is actually only one stage of respiration. In fact, respiration is a 4-event process, you could say. There's pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, respiratory gas transport, and then internal respiration. And we're going to be looking a little bit at each one of these today. So pulmonary ventilation is just simply us breathing in and out. When we're talking about breathing, that's the fancy term for it would be pulmonary ventilation. Air goes into our lungs, and then carbon dioxide comes out of our lungs. That's the first step. Once we inhale, and there's that exchange that's going on where the oxygen will go into the capillaries and the carbon dioxide will leave the capillaries and into the lungs. This is what's known as external respiration. Respiration, in this sense, when we're talking about here, is simply that process of oxygen transferring from one tissue to another and carbon dioxide doing the same. If you remember, we've talked about cellular respiration, and what cellular respiration is when it uses that oxygen. And so in order to use that oxygen, there has to be external respiration and internal respiration. And there is a difference, and we're going to look at those here in just a second. But for external respiration, what's important to understand is that external respiration is the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide specifically to and from the alveoli. In other words, the respiration or the gas exchange that's happening within the lungs. In fact, just these two events of respiration are the events that actually happen in the lungs. The last two events that we're going to be talking about in a second happen everywhere else in the body, more so dealing with the cardiovascular system, but nonetheless, they play a role in respiration in the sense that we're still dealing with the transportation of oxygen and the exchange of that oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the blood. And so, of course, for external respiration to happen, first of all, as I've said so many times already, oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli into the bloodstream. But what has to happen specifically is that oxygen doesn't just go into the bloodstream. It has to be carried by a red blood cell. And specifically, it can only be carried by a red blood cell if those red blood cells have the proper hemoglobin. And so what's going to happen is those oxygen molecules or atoms are going to bind to the hemoglobin molecules that are found within the blood. And then that blood can transport it. Whereas for the most part, our carbon dioxide is actually just going to be transported through the plasma. There is a small portion of carbon dioxide that will be attached to the hemoglobin as well as it's being transported, but it's not going to interfere with our ability to carry oxygen, and it's not its primary way of transportation. Also, if you'll notice though, for this exchange to happen, for the CO2 to diffuse from our capillaries into the alveoli, it has to be reconverted back into carbon dioxide. And so what's actually going on here is when we look at internal respiration, we'll look at this as well, but when our cells are going to give off this carbon dioxide, we can't just have pure carbon dioxide in our bloodstream. It's actually very toxic, and we have these bicarbonate ions, and that's still not too good. We have these certain enzymes that are going to help us turn it into carbonic acid, and our bloodstream can handle carbonic acid a lot better. But when we have to diffuse that carbonic acid, in other words, when we have to get rid of that carbon dioxide, it's going to have to transfer back into CO2 in order for it to diffuse through the capillaries and into the alveoli. So as this carbonic acid gets to the capillaries of the alveoli, it's going to revert back to the CO2 so it can diffuse back into the alveoli. So that's external respiration. Pulmonary ventilation is simple breathing in and out. External respiration is when we breathe in and out, we're going to have that transfer or that exchange of gases within the lungs. Then the next two steps of respiration are going to be happening throughout the body, and that is the transportation of these respiratory gases, which is just simply how our blood, the cardiovascular system, is going to carry these gases to the places that they need to go. The blood is going to pump that deoxygenated blood, in other words, the blood with the carbon dioxide, back to the lungs so it can get rid of it. And it's also going to pump that blood with the oxygen to every single cell in our body so it can use the oxygen that it needs for cellular respiration, which leads into the last and final event of respiration, which is internal respiration. So where external respiration deals with gas exchange from the outside, hence external, internal respiration is going to deal with respiration on the inside of our bodies. In other words, how our internal cells are exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide via the bloodstream. And so here it says, it's just simply titled on this little diagram, tissue cell. This tissue cell represents any cell in our body that you can think of that's going to need oxygen, which is every cell in our body. So, for example, think of it could be a neuron, it could be a liver cell, it could be a muscle cell, it could be a bone cell even. You name it, any cell in our body that's doing cellular respiration is going to need oxygen. And so internal respiration, what's going to happen is, again, just like we had capillaries in the alveolar ducts that were allowing that gas exchange between the lungs, we have capillaries connecting the bloodstream or our arteries and veins to every single cell in our body. That's what those tiny little capillaries are for, so they can do this gas exchange. Because if these cells can't get rid of their CO2, that's not going to be good. And if they don't have oxygen, that's not going to be good. And so they need a way to get this oxygen. So again, these red blood cells are going to transfer their oxygen that's needed through diffusion into the tissue cells. Those tissue cells, likewise, they have this buildup of carbon dioxide, and they're going to unload that carbon dioxide into the bloodstream. Now again, this carbon dioxide can't stay as carbon dioxide. It needs to turn into this bicarbonate ion in order to safely travel all the way back to the lungs. And so what's going to happen is there's a specific enzyme within our blood that's going to take this carbon dioxide, it's going to take a water molecule as well, take the carbon dioxide, add it with the water molecule, turn that into a carbonic acid, and then we're going to add another hydrogen group to make this carbonate ion. And then this carbonate ion can safely travel through the bloodstream until it gets to the lungs, where it's going to be turned back into CO2 so it can diffuse. So again, a few different steps, But what I really want you to take away from internal respiration is just the simple fact that what we're dealing with here is oxygen going into our tissue cells, and those tissue cells giving off their carbon dioxide so they can go back to the lungs to get rid of that CO2. That's where the CO2 in our body comes from, is all of our cells doing this cell respiration. So, the last thing we're going to look at today is just simply how we breathe. Breathing was the first step we kind of talked about briefly in our 4 steps of respiration, and it's the one that we most often think of with the respiratory system because it's doing the mechanical work of breathing. Without that pulmonary ventilation, there is no exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so there's 2 phases to this. There's the inspiration or inhalation, which is when we breathe in, and then there's expiration or exhalation, which is simply air leaving the lungs. What's going to be happening and how this is going to work is what's going to happen in the lungs is there's going to be a change in volume and gas pressure. And what we mean by that is if you've taken any geometry or just think about any bottle that carries a liquid, that capacity to carry that liquid inside the bottle, that's its volume. And so if it has a large volume, it can carry more liquid. If it has a small volume, it can carry less liquid. Likewise, it's the same with gases. If it has a large volume, it can carry a lot of gas. If it has a small volume, it can't carry a lot of gas. And so what's happening during this breathing process is when we breathe in, we create a higher volume, allowing more air to flow in. And then when we exhale, we decrease that volume, the amount of gas that can stay there. And that's also going to increase the pressure. And we're going to look at that step by step. So the first step or phase is inspiration or inhalation. And this is where that muscle known as the diaphragm really comes into play. Also, if you remember way back from when we talked about muscles, our external and internal intercostal muscles are going to play a role in breathing. Specifically, when we're inhaling, it's the external intercostal muscles that are going to expand the rib cage. So when you breathe in, so take a deep breath. When you breathe in, your external intercostal muscles are expanding the rib cage. That diaphragm is contracting. In other words, it's getting tighter. And what this does is this increases the volume of the rib cage, that thoracic cavity. And as it does so, it almost creates like this vacuum within it, which is going to make the lungs expand. And as these lungs expand, it's going to increase their volume. And in doing so, when their volume increases, we've now decreased the pressure inside the lungs. And so, in a nutshell, what this means is that because our lungs can carry more, there's more space, I guess you could say, to fill with that air. And so the pressure has decreased, allowing that air to flow in. There's a model that if we were in class, I would show you guys, but we're not in class right now, so I don't have it. But there is a video that I linked down in the description that shows how you could even make a model of this, that shows how our diagram is helping with that pressure change, where it's going to create that vacuum, decreasing the pressure and increasing the volume of our lungs. And so that's how we inhale. When we inhale, that inspiration, it's going to create like that vacuum, so it's going to increase the volume, decrease the pressure, allowing air from outside to flow into the lungs. It's going to be the exact opposite during expiration or exhalation. And so our diaphragm relaxes and our internal intercostal muscles are going to contract. Now, our internal intercostal muscles aren't going to play as big of a role here as our external did. For the most part, it's just the relaxing of the external intercostal muscles that are going to help with that expiration. These internal intercostal muscles will contract, and they're going to contract more though when we're doing forced breathing. Forced breathing would be generally like if we're doing exercises, or even if we have a cold or pneumonia. Because what's happening when we have a cold or pneumonia, we have mucus buildup within the lungs and the trachea and the bronchial tube sometimes, and specifically with pneumonia or bronchitis. And when this happens, the lungs, when they relax and they're trying to push out that air, that mucus kind of blocks that air from leaving. And so it has to really force that air out, it has to really push it. And so that's where that forced breathing comes in. That's where those intercostal muscles are really going to be working harder to push that air out, to work past the mucus. And so when this happens and our diaphragm relaxes and the internal intercostal muscles are going to contract, pushing the rib cage back in, it's going to squeeze the lungs, and the lungs will push air out. And so the volume decreases, and our pressure is also going to increase. To kind of help with that understanding of pressure, one of the things I was thinking of earlier was kind of like when you have a bottle, like one of the cheap water bottles, and some of you might know what I'm already talking about. But when you take that water bottle that's empty and you twist the bottle, and you keep twisting it and keep twisting it and keep twisting it, and you make it where you can feel that there's a lot of pressure in that bottle, and then you kind of barely turn the cap so it pops right off. The way that happens is you've decreased the volume of that bottle, and in doing so, you still have that same amount of gas that's in the bottle, but you've pushed that gas together, so you have increased the pressure. And so that's what's happening, is you've decreased the volume, increasing the pressure, and so naturally that pressure is wanting to go out. That's what happens when you pop the lid off. Likewise, when we increase the pressure in our lungs, it's wanting to push that air out. Hence, expiration or exhalation. So just to kind of recap, inspiration, our lungs are going to expand. This increase in volume is going to allow the gas that's in the lungs to kind of float more freely, decreasing the pressure, allowing for that flow of air into the lungs. Whereas when those muscles relax and the internal intercostal muscles are going to contract, pushing in on those ribs, we're going to decrease the volume, which also increases the pressure, pushing air out. And so that is pulmonary ventilation in a nutshell, basically. Pulmonary ventilation is the first step of the respiration cycle. We also have the external respiration, which is just simply the exchange of gases within the lungs. Then we have those respiratory gases that are being transported throughout the body, and then as they're transported throughout the body, we have internal respiration, where the gases are exchanged from those tissue cells into the blood and then transferred back to the lungs for the process to start all over again. That's the physiology of the respiratory system. And with that, we end our notes here. These are your last notes for the entire year. We have done it. We are done. And so, remember, Friday is our test. Our test is going to be over the blood, the circulatory system, and the respiratory system. It is open note, but make sure that you have your notes, make sure that you understand your notes, make sure you know where to find that information in the notes. And as always, if you have any questions about what we've discussed here, or maybe something about the test, let me know through a mind, and I will talk to you guys later.